Adaptation choice, option A. Olivia is the founder and majority owner of the luxury brand Hamilton Atelier. Adapt necessary. They laughed at my old shoes. Not the polite, sorry, I stepped in mud laugh, but the kind that settles like frost across a room, a tiny spreading chill aimed only at me. I felt it at my ankles first, the coolness of silk and crystal and voices that meant nothing to the small scuff marks on the leather of shoes I had loved until they had finally given up. I looked down, because it's what you do when you want the world to forget you exist. You lower your head and pretend the thing that is making you small is the only thing in the room. But that night, the room refused to let me disappear. There was a chandelier the size of a small planet, orchids lined like sentinels across the center of the room, waiters balancing trays as steady as if their lives depended on it. Tables carved in lacquer and gilded numbers that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Up front, the VIP table, polished faces, expensive suits, the kind of laughter that folds into itself like a secret. Behind it, table 12, where they put people you could afford to ignore. Table 12 had my name printed nowhere on it. I am Olivia Hamilton. I am 35, I teach second grade, I own 39 pairs of mismatched socks that I cannot bring myself to throw away, and yes, I still have the shaky handwriting of a woman who spends more time writing lesson plans than writing impression statements. I am also, for reasons I will explain, the founder and majority owner of Hamilton Atelier. I have kept that part of my life quiet. You teach for the children, not for applause. You give your best work without a billboard. I wanted to be loved for the sticky-fingered, earnest woman who sat on a tiny plastic chair at 7 in the morning and read picture books until the fluorescent light buzzed, not for whatever celebrity a name on a storefront might bring. So when my father's assistant asked, entirely without irony, which table I preferred, I said, any table where the teachers are sitting. I lied. I said it with the comfortable voice of the child you bet won't embarrass you at a party. But my hands were cold under the napkin. If you've ever been quietly erased in a room full of people who expect you to be grateful for the crumbs of their attention, then stay. If you've ever felt that sting in your chest when someone publicly decides your worth, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because you are not alone. This gala was supposed to be about celebration. Robert Hamilton was retiring after 36 years as principal of the school district I grew up in and taught in. Dad wore his retirement like a medal he had polished himself. The invitations were thick. The hotel ballroom smelled faintly of lemon and wax, and my stepmother, Patricia, arrived like a headline. Hair a perfect planned wave, dress the shade of money, smile camel smooth. She moved through the room with the kind of assurance that had been purchased, decorated, and then insured. On paper, our family looked like the kind of story magazines tell when they want to write about stability. In person, the seams showed. My father and Patricia had married the summer I finally stopped waiting for him to notice my Teacher of the Year plaque on the mantel. Their new life involved a foundation, a board, and an ambition for the family name to mean an institution, not a person. That was fine. Institutions have utility. The problem came when institutions ate people's names for breakfast and left the people to sweep up. I had taught third grade for 12 years when Tommy joined my class. Tommy could not, to save his life, match letters and sounds. He would stare at a book like an old man trying to recall a tune he loved. He would come to school with his hair in a wind-blown halo, and he would hand me drawings of planets and ask 1,000 questions about dragons. One afternoon after lunch, I sat with him under the reading lamp and we whispered through the phonics cards like spies. He traced a B with his tiny finger. He sounded it out, he read bat. The room must have been a room of miracles because the way he looked up at me, like I'd handed him a passport to some secret country, changed everything. He wrote me a letter the next week. Miss Olivia, it said in crayon, thank you for my words. He kept that letter in his desk all year. I kept it in my teacher box. Those letters are what I thought about as I stepped into the ballroom. Handmade paper hearts and misshapen suns crowded my memory like a parade. When the seating cards were distributed, the problem began like all small catastrophes do, a small detail ignored. My name, which had been on the original RSVP list, was nowhere on the meticulous place settings waiting at the VIP table. Where there should have been a faintly embossed Olivia Hamilton, there was only a blank card, pale as if someone had decided I didn't exist. Patricia noticed first and smiled with the polished kindness of someone who recently received confirmation that the world had rearranged itself in her favor. "Oh, Robert," she said with the same sweet, syrupy voice she used at charity luncheons. "We must have had a mix-up. We'll fix that right away." "That's all right," I told her. "My voice was the one you use when you're trying on armor. I'll sit with the teachers." "Of course," she said, as if I had volunteered to go to the broom closet. "Besides, table 12 is so intimate." Table 12. Even the number sounded like a sentence. It was meant to be forgetting disguised as arrangement, exile disguised as intimacy. I let them fold the napkin into a shape at the edge of the table and placed my hands in my lap. There were 6 teachers at table 12 that night. Ms. Vega, who taught art, Mr. Baxter, who had been my 5th grade science teacher and now taught middle school, Mrs. Chen, who taught ESL, and 3 others whose faces I knew in the way you know family portraits hung in a hallway. Familiar silhouettes, names spoken with respect in faculty meetings. Around us, the room buzzed. My father took the stage with a practiced grin, and for a few honest seconds I allowed myself to imagine the generosity in his eyes would reach me. He had always been charismatic. He could make a bad radio voice sound like the voice of God. He took the podium and the cameras rolled in a way that made you realize the world was not just present but recording, storing every syllable for later. He spoke about leadership, about duty, about the value of legacy. He told stories that drew polite laughter. When he mentioned the foundation that would be set up in his name, the room leaned in like the air was waiting for a coin to drop. "Tonight," he said, "we're announcing the board appointment to oversee the Hamilton Educational Trust. It's important that the person named has vision, legal expertise, and connections to expand our mission. I'm delighted to appoint my stepdaughter, Jessica Morrison." Jessica slid into the VIP seat like a chair had been warmed just for her. She wore the kind of dress that made no apologies for its price. She wore the silence of people who had never had to take a second job. Applause bloomed like fireworks. Patricia blushed as if someone had written her name on a prize ribbon. Someone at the table popped a champagne bottle and the cork flew like a little shot of applause into the air. I did not move. The breath in my chest pooled like a small sea and would not spill. For a moment I allowed the old narrative to run its old footage. The missed graduation I had celebrated quietly months before when my father failed to show up because he had a donor dinner. The way my ideas for teacher stipends had been discussed in meetings, and then shelved for future consideration. The countless PTA photos where I cropped myself out because I didn't want to be a punctuation mark in someone else's sentence. "Jessica has been a loyal advisor to our family for years," my father continued, heaping the kind of praise into his voice that made it impossible not to hear how carefully he was building a new story he wanted everyone to live in. "She will ensure the legacy that I've built continues and expands." He named the funding, $5 million, seed funding to be matched, an amount that made the table murmur and someone near the back audibly gasp. $5 million speaks like an earthquake. It changes how meetings are held, which doors unlock, whose resume matters. When he said Jessica's name, the cameras swiveled, the live stream pinged with new comments, and somewhere in that buzz I heard the soft, calculating sound of my own career being dismissed. It wasn't that my father didn't know what I had done. He'd seen the thank you cards, the glossy local news piece when our 3rd grade class had raised funds to send books to a shelter, the Teacher of the Year plaque in his house that gathered dust because no one thought to put it on the mantel with the others older and shinier. He knew. He simply decided that knowledge did not require allocation. I felt the kind of hot disappointment rarely reserved for public betrayals, an anger so quiet that it made the room's noise nearly indecent. People were watching, their phones lighting up like small suns. I had to do something to stop shrinking. My husband, Marcus, sat 2 seats away from me. Sometimes, especially in crowds, he seemed like a man in 2 dimensions. Handsome, impeccably dressed, his smile curated for cameras. He is not a man who enjoys attention for the wrong reasons. He has for years been excellent at being the calm. He and I moved through life with roles that complemented rather than canceled. He supported my long, chaotic teaching hours. I supported his quieter, more surgical efforts in business strategy. He had been present at many of the small things, Tommy's reading breakthrough included. He had encouraged me to start Hamilton Atelier as a small leatherworking side project 2 years before anything bigger happened. Make things that last, he told me when I first stitched together a prototype scarf in our kitchen at midnight, because he knew I liked the feeling of making something with my hands. I had not told anyone at school about the growth of Hamilton Atelier. It began as a workshop for artisans in the neighborhood. Teachers, seamstresses, people who needed steady hours. I designed a line of scarves and small leather goods that felt like comfort and discretion. Cashmere edges, stitched seams, a hidden pocket in a clutch. The brand was slow and careful. It did not scream. It folded itself into stores that appreciated craft. When the first major demand came, I panicked and sold a minority stake to a partner who could scale the supply chain. I did not want splashes. I wanted the money to fund teacher grants discreetly. So I kept the majority of the shares in my name, and I kept teaching. For reasons I still can't explain fully, I wanted my students to see me as their teacher first. I wanted to be judged by who I was in the classroom, not by the label inside a coat. Marcus knew everything, of course. He knew the bank accounts, the contracts, the people who made our small company run. He knew because he had helped me. He had also married into the Hamilton name and, in a strange reversal that often amused our friends, chose to take my last name when we got married, partly as a joke, partly as a statement about what our home would look like, an odd, deliberate equality. It had been just us, mostly, two stubborn people who preferred to make quietly meaningful things. That night, Marcus's phone buzzed twice, then a third time, and he smiled at nothing. He sent me a text, short and private. Remember why we started. Another one. Wait for the right moment. I do not usually read messages in public. It feels like crossing a line. But I read both, and the lines were a lifeline and a warning at once. When my father finished his speech and applause filled the room, things should have settled into champagne and small talk. Instead, Patricia's laughter cut through the air like a neat, polished knife. Jessica slipped a napkin from the VIP table and unfolded it as if it were an invitation to rule. My father's gaze found me once, but it landed like a stray coin at my feet and then moved on. That is when the first person from the hospitality staff came to my table with a tiny, apologetic smile and a paper placard. "We had a last-minute adjustment," she said, handing me a card that had been made minutes before, I suspected, by a flurried hand. On it, in a hurried font, was my name, but it meant nothing. The seat next to me was offered with the exact affection one reserves for an afterthought. At one point, I watched as a server carrying a silver tray nearly knocked into me and then, as if to make up for it, placed a sparkling water in front of someone else with a bowed apology. The room's kindness is sometimes reserved for the right kind of person. When the MC announced dessert, the cameras swiveled, catching each laugh and brush of lipstick. A guest at the VIP table raised his glass to my father and said, loudly enough that the microphone caught him, "What a shame about table 12. Laughter ricocheted. I had always thought that the phrase, "different isn't less than," was something you said in teacher meetings or printed on motivational posters. That night, it felt like a personal essay shoved under a door too small for all of us. I could have left. I considered it, walking out of a room that had already decided my value. Walking away would be some kind of quiet victory. But leaving would also let them cast me as the petulant daughter who stormed off. I wanted to stay. I wanted to be seen in the place where they had tried to forget me. So I stayed like a stubborn plant growing through a sidewalk crack. As dessert plates were cleared, my father stood again to make a quick comment. He praised the evening and then, casually as if announcing a weather report, he said he would be adding another item to the evening's program. Now, before we close, I'd like to discuss the new seat on the Hamilton Foundation Board. Jessica will be leading contract negotiations with our partners, including our major sponsor. The room shifted, leaning in to hear the sponsor's name. Sponsors are the oxygen of boards. Whoever holds cash holds a microphone. The name of the sponsor mattered. "My thanks to the Hamilton Trust," my father said, glancing at Jessica like a man who had placed a chess piece in a perfect spot. "And gratitude to..." Then, as if on cue and with perfect timing, a woman from the sponsor table seated across the room stood and made her way to the podium. She tapped the mic and announced the name of their corporation, the kind of name that sounds like innovation and venture capital stitched together. The sponsor's representative spoke politely about aligning with the foundation's goals. Cameras panned, people clinked glasses. At the edge of the room, a television monitor flashed the feed that had been streaming the evening. A small message scrolled, "Live. Hamilton Retirement Gala. On my feed, because of course the internet records everything, someone had already started a comment thread. Table 12? Really? Underneath it, another comment. Who sits where matters. A dozen emojis, some smug, some sympathetic, hovered like moths. As my father finished a final sentence about legacy, Patricia leaned toward Jessica and whispered something that made Jessica laugh with the kind of ease that says, "We are together in this." I clapped politely because otherwise the room would have a hole where my silence had been. But the clapping felt like it belonged to another person. When the final notes of the orchestra swelled and people began to stand, I felt a hand touch my arm. It was Marcus, and his voice was a low thrum. "Do not make this about them," he said. "Make it about us." There was that same private steadiness that had anchored him through my endless nights of lesson planning and early mornings of craft work. He squeezed my hand, then rose and walked toward the front, as if to check on something that was his to check. I watched him go and then watched the world close in. The MC announced a short video about the Foundation's future plans. The screen lit up with images of children in capes and teachers in classrooms, all of which felt like the kind of imagery that should have included people like me, quietly building out the work behind the scenes. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. My father, in front of every camera and donor, named Jessica to the board seat. And then he said, "We'll be transferring the sponsorship oversight to our chosen partners immediately, to ensure the fund's growth." He could have meant many things. But in the room filled with people who equate partnership with a handshake and a check, it translated as, "Someone else will decide what happens now." I stood up. The action surprised me at the time. It felt less like a decision and more like an automatic reaction, the way your hand jerks when you hear a startling noise. I walked toward the front, and the room seemed to fall into a kind of slow motion that only happens in moments you know will be replayed. My father looked at me with the face of a man about to correct a small misstep. Patricia looked at me with the hint of a smile that says, "You could have been with us if you had chosen differently." "I'd like to speak," I said, and for a second the air around me was faintly electric. Cameras shifted toward the sudden point of drama. Someone in a suit whispered into an earpiece. A woman from security stood up and made her way toward me with the efficiency of someone trained to remove problems from spaces of privilege. My voice shook, not from fear, but from a strange clenched energy. "I am a teacher," I said. "I have been a teacher in this district for 12 years. I know what it's like to come in early and leave late. I know what it's like to buy books with my own money so a child can hold a story in their hands. Our teachers are the ones who do the work you applaud in speeches. They should have a seat at the table when decisions about their classrooms are being made." There was a ripple like a small animal passing through a crowd. Someone sighed loudly enough for a mic to catch it. My father set his jaw and said, low and clipped, "Olivia, this is not the time for theatrics." "Then when?" I asked. "When is the time? Because if there is going to be a Hamilton Educational Trust that decides the fate of classrooms, the people who spend their days in classrooms need a voice. They need funding that reaches the rooms, not just glossy brochures." A bubble of awkwardness spread. Patricia's hand went up to her throat like a curtain being drawn. Jessica's smile hardened just a fraction as if a seam had been pulled. Someone in the room, with a tone that was supposed to be comforting, said, "Olivia, maybe you should speak with your father after the event." "That's the point," I said, and my voice found a steadier note. After does not help the child who cannot buy reading materials next week because a donor's decision is delayed. After does not help the teacher who will be asked to cover classes without pay. This is about choices made now. At my words, someone near the front sniffed, as though my practicality had become an offense. Then a man with a press badge squeezed through and asked for a quote. A woman with a smartphone started a video and the little red light blinked, "Live." Someone in the kitchen shouted something I couldn't make out. The security guard stopped 2 feet away and looked at me like I had appeared on an operating table. I said, and the room grew quiet enough to make breathing into the open air audibly selfish. That before any decisions are finalized from this table, we ensure that active classroom teachers are represented on the board, and that at least 20% of the seed funding goes directly to classroom grants with teacher input. For a full beat, nothing happened. Then my father said in a tone that carried years of authority and privilege, "Olivia, this isn't how we do things." "Then show me how we do it better." My voice sharpened a little. Bring the teachers in. Someone from the security team placed a hand on my elbow. Ma'am, we can take this conversation somewhere more private, he offered, with the specific kind of politeness reserved for people who are about to be escorted out. I pulled away. I want this to be public. That small defiance is probably what made them act. The head of security swallowed and snapped a radio. Two of the donors nearby began to look uncomfortable. People began standing and leaning back like a wave pulling at the shore. And then the social moment hit the room. Someone live-streamed the confrontation, and within minutes the comments multiplied. "Is that his daughter?" one asked. "Why is she being rude?" another said. "She teaches. Bless her heart." The tone of those comments was a small public gallows. A woman in a sparkly gown murmured, "This is embarrassing." Patricia squeezed my father's hand and whispered something that made his face tighten. Jessica's eyes flitted to the cameras as if to calculate, in real time, the cost of an apology. The orchestra stopped playing. People pulled out their phones. The room had become a theater, and I was, in their eyes, the unexpected actor who had wandered onto the stage. Security moved closer. I felt the soft, invasive pressure of a hand on my shoulder as an officer suggested gently as a guillotine blade, that I should move back to my table. The implication was clear. For some people in that room, a teacher's place was where a teacher always sat, out of the way, politely applauding. I turned to the guard and said, "You can escort me to the lobby if you must, but let it be known that I'm asking this in front of everyone who matters tonight." His jaw tightened. "We're only trying to keep the event orderly." "Orderly for whom?" I asked. "For people like me, or for the names on your invitations?" There was a flurry of whispered conversations. Marcus, who had been 2 steps away, finally stepped forward. He moved with a different rhythm now, not the tentative partner, but the man who understands logistics and leverage. For a moment he looked at my father, then at me, and then at the room as if measuring how much of our private life he would now make public. "Robert," he said quietly, and those 2 syllables had a weight to them. Heads turned toward him. "We need to talk about the sponsorship language." At that, people blinked. Sponsorship language is the sort of talk that usually belongs in boardrooms and contracts, not dinner platters, but it is the kind of talk that changes how money flows and who controls it. My father looked surprised, the way a man is when someone opens a hidden letter and reads it aloud. Patricia's smile flickered. Jessica's hand tightened around a fork until the tines bent. For the first time that night, something in the room shifted from petty to precarious. The cameras zoomed in, almost hungry for the script to follow, and in my chest, something like relief trembled. Maybe the story would not end with me folded into invisibility. Maybe for once, a contract clause could do what 1,000 speeches had not. People leaned forward. The security guard retreated a step. The MC, sensing a pivot in the evening, adjusted his posture as if waiting for the next act the crowd had come to see. Marcus's voice held steady. "Before any final decisions are made tonight, I need to make a clarification about our key partners' contract terms," he said. "They have explicit language that ties sponsorship to active educators and the allocation of funds to in-classroom programs. If those terms aren't met, there are clauses that enable reassignment." No one moved for a long moment. The sentence hung like a rope above a well. I looked at my father and saw, for the first time, a man who perhaps had misread the contract the way he misread my life, as something that could be arranged with a winning smile. And then someone laughed. It was a high, brittle sound from a woman who had never had to fight for a pencil, and it landed like a pebble in a pond I had been trying not to fall into. "You can't be serious," Patricia said with that same small, instructive tone she used when correcting a child's grammar. "Contracts are for business, Marcus. We are talking about community." "Sometimes business is how communities are funded," Marcus answered. His voice was quiet enough that a camera had to lean in to catch it. The security guard edged closer, and I felt the old shoes I wore, scuffed at the heel and loving me in a way no one else did. They had been with me through parent-teacher conferences and 1,000 recesses. They were not the armor the room expected, but they were mine. "You will not be able to finesse this by making it personal," my father said finally. There was a warning in his words now, as if the whole evening might shatter into something none of us had prepared for. I looked at Marcus, and he nodded minutely, not to tell me to step down, but to tell me to be ready. The metaphor of the night had shifted. The gloves had come off, though it was still unclear how the fight would be judged. Cameras bore down like an anxious jury. Table 12, the so-called exile, hummed with a different kind of electricity now, one that said, perhaps, that the people who do the work might finally have a language that matters. I heard the mutters increase as the sponsors at the back of the room exchanged notes. The live feed's comments spun faster. "What's going on?" someone typed. "Is she seriously?" Another. At the far end of my vision, Tommy's handwriting floated through my mind like a talisman, and for a second, I pictured him opening a book that had been bought because someone chose to change how money flowed. The head of security cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "if you continue to disrupt the event, we'll have to ask you to leave." I straightened my shoulders. "Then it's a good thing I plan to stay," I said. At that sentence, the room shifted again. A hand on an earpiece buzzed. A camera operator jutted a lens forward as if to catch the exact second the scene would fall apart. My pulse beat, fast, steady, and I felt a strange mixture of dread and a wild, clarifying hope. If structures could be moved with language and a clause, with a contract displayed in red, then maybe humiliation need not be the last line of my story. Marcus looked at me with something I had not seen in a while. A small, fierce pride. Then he walked toward the podium, and the room waited. Marcus reached the podium with a slow, deliberate walk that felt nothing like the quick little steps he took to the bakery on Sunday mornings. He stood there, stared at the microphones for a breath, and then looked straight at my father like he was pointing out a misfiled paper in a stack labeled Facts. "I want to clarify something about the partnership language between the Hamilton Trust and its primary sponsor," he said. His voice was quiet, but the quiet had teeth. "There are specific contractual obligations that tie sponsor funds to in-classroom programs and to active educator participation in governance. Those clauses aren't decorative, they're enforceable. And because of our existing partnership agreements with that sponsor, we have both standing and responsibility to ensure those clauses are followed." The crowd blinked. Someone near the back muttered, "He has a lawyer." The MC shifted uneasily, like a man who had realized the night's script had been rewritten. Marcus asked for a projector and a simple request from the tech team. The relevant clause be shown for people to read. A staff member brought the laptop forward, and the contract, already scanned and in our possession, bloomed on the large screen behind the stage. The words were clear, plain English, not a lawyerly forest of Latin. The camera panned to the screen, and the live feed paused with the perfect greed of the internet. The clause read, simplified and legible. Sponsor funds allocated to the Hamilton Educational Trust shall be directed to in-classroom programs, where at least 20% of the allocation is determined by active, practicing educators selected by district committees. Failure to adhere to these terms will permit reallocation of pledged funds to affiliated educational initiatives, identified by Hamilton Atelier within 30 days of written notice. You could feel the room make space for the sentence as if it were a new piece of furniture sliding across hardwood. My father looked at the words like someone reading in a language he'd once learned in college and then forgotten. Patricia's face tightened into a smile that had acquired a chisel. Marcus then turned the projection toward the logo of Hamilton Atelier. It was a subtle, elegant mark. 2 overlapping H's, clean and quiet, the sort of logo that chose restraint. He looked at me for the first time all evening, not with the wait-to-see expression of someone who keeps their feelings private, but with a look that said, "Now." "I'm chair of a small group associated with Hamilton Atelier," he continued. "We are partners with the sponsor named tonight. We value the conditions in the contract because they reflect the work our teachers do. If those terms are not respected, then we will, under the mechanisms provided, request reassignment of the funds to programs that meet the contractual criteria, which include leadership from active teachers." My stomach did something odd, an ugly, hopeful lurch. The sponsor's representative at the side of the room had gone pale. Jessica's fingers were white around her champagne flute. The live stream chat spooled out like thread being pulled, and I could almost hear the comments as they arrived. "Wait, did he just... Is that his wife's brand? She owns a brand?" And then Marcus did what no one in that room expected. He said my name, quietly but in a sentence that broadcasted everything it contained. Olivia Hamilton, he said, is the founder and majority owner of Hamilton Atelier, and has directed us to ensure that corporate partners honor these terms that prioritize active educators. The effect of those 8 words was immediate and cinematic. There was a sound in the ballroom, a collective inhale, the noise people make when someone lifts their foot off a trap door. Heads turned toward me like lighthouses searching for a small boat. Cameras refocused. The woman who had laughed earlier went very still, like a person who had knelt down and found a picture that had once been under her shoe. For a beat, I felt as though I were watching someone else be surprised. I watched the faces of people who had been mocking my shoes only minutes before. They were suddenly reading a different book about me. Some were baffled. Others adjusted their expressions to the new information as if they'd been handed a program and needed to find their seat again. My father began, and it came out less like a question than like a man trying to stitch a new story onto an old suit. This is... He cleared his throat and reached for the authority of a man who had learned to navigate ceremonies through charm. Olivia, why would you keep that from me? From us? Because, I said, and I could feel the room waiting for either the confession or the grand reveal. I wanted my students to know me as their teacher. I wanted my work in classrooms to be real without it being filtered through wealth or name. I thought, naively perhaps, that being invisible to people like you meant they would love what I do for what it is, not because of what it funds. Patricia's lips tightened. This is about theater, she said. This is about spectacle. This, Marcus answered, is about where the money goes. He folded his hands like someone closing a ledger. And if the terms say teachers decide at least 20% of how it is used, then teachers need a seat at the table. The sponsor's representative, an elegant woman in a charcoal suit, had not sat idly by. She stepped forward, microphone in hand, and said in a voice meant to be neutral, "We were not expecting this level of complication tonight. Our agreement is with the Hamilton Trust, and we will, of course, review any concerns. In the meantime," Marcus said, "our position is this. Until the allocation terms are honored and there is evidence of teacher representation in decision-making, the partner funds will be placed under reassessment and withheld from distribution." He spoke in the kind of way that did not promise lawsuits or dramatic headlines. He simply stated a fact about where funds would be temporarily directed. "We will move funds into an escrow-like account under Hamilton Atelier's affiliated philanthropic vehicle, where they can be allocated quickly to classroom grants while governance is clarified." The sponsor rep blinked. You could see the calculation. Money in the name of brand reputation is the sort of thing that smells like risk when it sits under public scrutiny. She looked at the sponsor table, at the donors who had been laughing earlier, and then back at the screen where the clause sat as plain as bone. "Please," she said finally, in a tone that tried to be conciliatory, "let's take this to a private discussion now. Public accusations are unhelpful. Public transparency is what is being asked for," I said. "We are asking simply that the people who spend their lives in classrooms have a voice and that funds reach the rooms themselves." A dozen photographers were already snapping. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Say it louder, Olivia!" and 100 phones swiveled like obedient owls. For the first time that evening, I noticed Mrs. Chen from my table 12 standing up. Her hands were soft and steady. "We don't need apologies," she said, her voice calm and precise. "We need seats. The teachers here know what children's classrooms need. Put us in the room, not in the brochure." It felt like a small army stepping into the light. Mr. Baxter and Ms. Vega, who had smiled politely from our exile table all evening, joined her. In a moment that might have seemed spontaneous to anyone watching, the 6 of us from table 12 moved forward together, not as a theatrical stunt, but as a coalition with names and stories and long lists of receipts from classroom supply purchases. The sponsor representative nodded toward the head of the foundation's board, David Chen, who stood up and walked to the mic like a man who'd been given a problem and was ready to read the manual. He said he needed time to consult the board and the sponsor, and suggested an emergency meeting the next morning, with press embargoes and governance proposals to be drafted. He asked for calm, which at that point was a request for something we no longer had the right to ask for. The room itself fractured into 2 halves. Those who had been comfortably indifferent, and those who suddenly had to process an institutional pivot. Social media had already exploded. Within 15 minutes of Marcus's words hitting the live feed, the event was trending locally and then nationally. Clips of me standing by the podium were being shared with captions that ranged from admiration to snark. Table 12 trended at first as a mocking hashtag, then a steady current of support began to undercut the mockery. Teachers, parents, students, and strangers posting photos of their own worn shoes with the caption, "Different isn't less than." By morning, the sponsor had issued a terse statement. "We support the full review of partnership terms to ensure equitable, educator-led allocation of funds." In practice, that meant they were not writing checks that week. They had paused public disbursements while they talked to lawyers and PR teams. In the interim, Hamilton Atelier's philanthropic arm, the small vehicle Marcus and I had quietly seated when the brand's earliest profits arrived, announced it would temporarily assume immediate grant responsibilities to avoid harming classrooms. I did not plan any of this to be theatrical. I had not wanted cameras to interpret my anger. But the mechanism we used, a clause in a contract that I had insisted be included when I partnered Hamilton Atelier with ethical funding guidelines, worked like a lever. I had thought of contracts as dry things. What I discovered that night is that a sentence on paper can be a springboard for real decisions. Within 48 hours, donors who had been in the ballroom the night before messaged privately, some apologizing, some defensive, some precisely offering support. Local teachers started a GoFundMe that raised enough to provide emergency supplies for 50 classrooms in 2 days. Parent groups organized to support rules requiring teacher representation on boards tied to classroom funding. Journalists called, alumni called. My phone lit up with messages from people I had taught years ago. Simple notes of pride and a dozen photos of kids in pajama shirts with Table 12 written on them like a badge. It would be easy to frame that moment as triumph, the scuffed shoes that defeated a ballroom. But real life is rarely a neat arc. There were costs, personal and public, that came with what we did. Patricia called every week for a month in a carefully modulated voice that said she wanted reconciliation, but seemed to test how far she could get me to apologize. She sent articles about reputation management and suggested professional help to heal family dynamics. My father left 2 voicemails that vacillated between stiffness and a plea for me to understand his responsibilities. I responded with calm boundaries. I told him that I loved him in the way a person can love someone who disappoints them, with the truth. I asked for a series of conditions. Public acknowledgement that teacher voices must be included in decisions about funding of classrooms. A commitment that events meant to celebrate him would not ignore the people who made the work real. And, most importantly, that any future family announcements about the foundation be co-signed by teachers chosen from the district. He balked at the tone, but, perhaps wanting the appearance of cooperation, agreed to attend the emergency board meeting the next morning. The boardroom was deliberate, professional, and awkward. People in suits sat across from people who handed in lists of classroom needs. Lawyers asked for pauses. Someone kept pouring coffee like it would solve more than it ever does. David Chen chaired the meeting with consummate neutrality. We read the clause aloud, and sponsors and board members argued about interpretation. Jessica made a case for herself, claiming competence and loyalty. I listened. I spoke, outlining a plan that put teachers at the center. A rotating teacher advisory seat with voting rights on allocations, 20% of seed funds earmarked for in-classroom microgrants, and a public reporting mechanism for distribution of funds. I suggested the creation of a rapid response fund for classroom emergencies and the inclusion of mental health stipends for teachers who often bear the invisible costs of care. I brought with me a stack of letters, some handwritten, some typed, thanking me for simple things. You bought markers when our supplies ran out. You read to me when my dad was gone. You stayed. These were not theatrical props. They were the fuel of why I was tired and why I cared so fiercely. There were moments of real negotiation, not drama. The sponsor wanted assurance their brand would not be used irresponsibly. I wanted assurance funds would reach teachers with minimal bureaucracy. We compromised on an oversight mechanism that included teachers in both advisory and voting capacities, and that allowed certain funds to be dispersed directly by a teacher-led committee without going through the full foundation bureaucracy. Jessica, in the end, accepted a role on the legal subcommittee, which meant she stayed involved but no longer had unilateral authority to decide allocations alone. David agreed to add 3 practicing teachers to the board immediately, including Mrs. Chen and Ms. Vega. What followed was a slow, practical rebuilding. Hamilton Atelier announced a formal philanthropic program, the Atelier Classroom Initiative, a luxury brand line whose proceeds would fund teacher grants and whose artisans included teachers from the community, a seismic idea that made for good press and meaningful work. The brand itself, graceful scarves and small leather goods, sold better than anyone predicted because people wanted to attach their purchases to something they believed in. Not everything was sparkling and perfect. There were ugly emails and tasteless comments online, but there were also heartfelt notes from teachers who said the grants were a lifeline. We launched the first round of grants within 2 weeks. 250 microgrants of $200 each were distributed directly to classrooms in our district. The money paid for books, reading corner rugs, specialized phonics cards, and in one case, a noise-dampening curtain for a neurodiverse student space. Within 3 months, an additional $500,000 was pledged by private donors who had been moved by the story and who wanted to see tangible classroom change. The Atelier Classroom Initiative became less of a PR line and more of a process. Teachers applied, committees reviewed, grants were awarded, and we published quarterly reports. People started to see the math of dignity. A 5-minute video of me reading a letter from Tommy, "Miss Olivia, I can read," went viral and was reposted by national education advocates. Tommy's mother posted a video of him reading at their kitchen table, and someone from a book company offered to send free leveled readers to our district. Tommy's progress was one of the moments I went back to in my mind. The small, stubborn routine of sitting with him and sounding out B's and D's. That work had never been flashy. It was daily and miraculous in increments. Watching his face light up as he read aloud the first full sentence felt like all the proof I needed that our choices mattered. In the weeks that followed, my life became a controlled frenzy. There were interviews and op-eds, but those were outside my small rituals. I kept teaching because I had promised the children, and myself, that I would not let the classroom be a prop in my life. I taught 2nd grade on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I met with the Teacher Advisory Committee or reviewed grant applications. I learned how to balance spreadsheets with lesson plans, how to read a budget and a picture book within the same heartbeat. When I walked into my classroom after the gala fallout, the kids screamed, not in a performative way, but with the pure, unrefined joy children save for adults they love. They held up signs they'd secretly made that read, simply, "Miss O rocks." Tommy, taller now with his hair in its familiar halo, clapped the loudest. He read a short passage to the class without hesitation, and when he looked at me, I saw years of work crystallize. He handed me a new letter, the handwriting cleaner than before. "Miss Olivia," it said, "you showed me words. Thank you." I folded it into my heart like a small, sacred thing. There were practical consequences for the household, too. Public attention tugged at our privacy. There were friends who offered praise and others who watched the arc with a kind of careful distance. Patricia stopped showing up at family dinners. She posted a carefully curated statement about philanthropy that managed to be both proud and remote. My father called more often, more haltingly, and sometimes he would read articles about the foundation on the phone as if that could be a bridge. I accepted that bridges are built slowly, usually with planks that creak. I told him I would listen. I told him I expected action if he hoped for closeness. He agreed to attend community events that centered teachers rather than simply being the face behind them. That was not reconciliation, it was accountability. There were moments I feared I would be swallowed by performative charity, the kind that wants applause but not the hard work of systemic change. To counter that, I insisted on transparency. Every quarter, we published a report that showed grants awarded, teacher feedback, and the percentage of funds going directly to classrooms. We created a hotline for teachers who needed emergency support and a small fund for mental health counseling. We hired a director of grants who had been a classroom teacher herself. We paid our board members modest stipends for their time because we did not want only the wealthy to be able to afford governance. The foundation's first-year metrics could feel like a press release if I let them. So instead, I'll tell you about 2 classrooms. Classroom A, Ms. Vega's art room, which used a $2,500 grant to buy adaptive art supplies for students with motor challenges. One child, who had been reluctant to touch paint because of sensory issues, began to paint in wide, joyous strokes. His mother told us the boy had started bringing home art projects and had put them up on the fridge, which in turn had opened doors for conversation at home that had not been there before. Classroom B, Mr. Baxter used a $1,800 grant to buy hands-on science kits and to secure a weekend workshop for students who didn't have family members who could supervise home experiments. Attendance at his after-school STEM club tripled, and a shy student named Layla, who had always sat in the back, presented her own project on renewable energy at the school science fair and won second place. Those small wins were not flashy. They were humbly transformative. Meanwhile, the Atelier line, our luxury scarves and clutches, became a way to connect craft to cause. We hired teachers and local seamstresses as artisans, paying them fair wages for their work. The brand's Teacher Artisan program paid summer stipends to teachers who participated, giving them alternative income that recognized their skilled labor without making them choose between a paycheck and their vocation. The paradox that had once amused us, luxury goods funding classrooms, shifted into a model that felt coherent. Quality goods made by people we respected helped fund direct classroom impact. Not every critic was satisfied. Some argued that a luxury brand should not be the centerpiece of a story about teachers and equity. I agree with that concern. My response was simple. Use whatever resources people bring to the table to fund authentic teacher-led change. If that means a scarf company helps fund reading corners, then do it with dignity and transparency and with teachers running the process. In the months that followed, Jessica's role evolved. She remained professionally present, but the board's control structure had changed. It now included active teachers with voting rights. She adapted, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with earnest resolve. Patricia's social circle shifted. People are fickle with scandal and even more fickle with redemption, so her public profile cooled. My father occasionally attended a classroom event and would stand in the back, watching children he had once taught decades ago run through a playground he had helped build. He clapped at the end like anyone else, and sometimes stood with a hand in his pocket, uncertain. I will not pretend the family healed overnight. Certain conversations remain heavy. Some relationships have thinned. But the boundary I set was clear. If being family meant being part of decisions that flattened teachers' voices, I would not be part of that version of family. If being family meant supporting the dignity of work, then I would meet them there. That boundary cost me. It also saved me. There were quieter personal moments that felt like balm. Marcus and I took long walks on Sunday mornings, and we sat in the kitchen and planned grant cycles with the same tender focus we once used to decide whether to buy a new set of kitchen knives. He continued to astonish me with his steadiness. Once, in mid-November, we found out we were expecting. It was such a private, ridiculous, wonderful thing amid the swirl. The news made the small room in my chest expand and then contract with fear and joy. I told the kids in my class when we had a circle time about new life and change. They squealed with the sort of sincerity only children have. Tommy made a card that read, "For the baby, books please." It arrived to me folded and earnest, and I kept it in my lesson plan book. The foundation matured into something I could trust to outlast an evening's headlines. Within a year, the Atelier Classroom Initiative had directly funded 1,200 microgrants, established a rapid response emergency fund, and paid summer stipends to 300 teachers who participated as artisans. We published reports, and we listened. Teacher feedback shaped our strategy more than any press release did. People asked me if I regretted keeping Hamilton Atelier private for so long. The honest answer is complicated. I kept it private because I loved the integrity of being seen for the work I did every day in the classroom. I wanted my students to know me as their teacher before they learned of my other life. That choice had a cost, because secrecy can look like shame, and a benefit. It allowed me to find a way to use the brand for teachers rather than the other way around. There were lessons stitched into every wrinkle of the year, that dignity in labor matters, that contracts are not faceless things but mechanisms that can be used for justice if we understand how to leverage them. That power is not an all-or-nothing game, but a structure you can tilt if you have the right fulcrum. And there was a lesson that came back to the shoes. People will try to define you by what you wear, but you are not a garment. Table 12 remained a phrase in our community lexicon, what exile looks like when you are made small, but it also became a rallying cry. I saw the words Table 12 on banners at school rallies and in handmade posters at neighborhood meetings, and I felt the small, ridiculous flicker of pride that something once meant to erase me had become a statement of solidarity. Different isn't less than. Different is necessary. I still teach because nothing about the way the world reshaped itself that year made me want to stop. If anything, I became more certain that the work was worth defending. Each morning when I crossed my classroom threshold, There are stacks of paper and the smell of pencil shavings and the faint, glorious chaos of being with children. I stand by the small plastic chair and I read picture books, and I sit on the floor and tie shoelaces, and I answer earnest questions about dinosaurs. There is a sense of fullness in the ordinary that the gala never measured. When people ask who won that night, the answer is messy. We didn't vanquish corporate indifference in a speech. We did force a pause and create a route for funds to reach classrooms in days rather than months. We created governance mechanisms that required teachers to be at the table. We changed some minds and exposed some thin skins. We also earned attention that brought new critics. The work is far from done. What I would ask from you, if this story lands with a small echo inside you, is this. Think about the teachers in your life. Consider what being at the table might mean in your community. If you have the means, support programs that provide direct help to classrooms. If you have time, show up at school meetings and ask questions. If you have a voice, use it to insist that educators' expertise be part of the decisions that affect children. If this moved you, consider supporting teacher-led initiatives in your area, volunteer, or share a story of a teacher who made a difference in your life. We'd like to hear it. We built a newsletter for the Atelier Classroom Initiative where teachers share what they've done with grants and what still needs doing. Sign up, learn, and if you can, give. When I look at my worn shoes now, they sit by the front door, scuffed at the heel, loved. I see them as the record of a life lived in service and stubbornness. They are proof that being ordinary doesn't mean being unseen. I wore them to a ballroom and the room laughed. Later, they watched me stand up and say that teachers belonged at the table. They watched us build a structure that actually listened to classrooms. They watched Tommy read his first book out loud. Different isn't less than. Different is sometimes the beginning of a better plan.